All right, I'm returning to a little bit longer format for a couple of reasons, not the least of which is I've had a request to try to turn some of these into podcasts. So I'm going to do that, or try to do it, and this format seems to work better. This is going to be a three-parter about gender and traditional gender roles, which is timely because a guy by the name of Dr. Scott Yenor from Boise State University recently at the National Conservatism Conference, Conservatism. I always want to say conservatism, but conservatism. Both are probably words, I bet. Conference in which he stated that things like feminism is to blame for some of the social ills we're experiencing, breakdown of the traditional family. He also said some stuff about wanting people to not recruit women into STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, math, not to encourage them to go into business, but to recruit more men and demand more of the men that you recruit, that sort of thing. So I'm going to examine the evidence he's given or the justification he's given for his argument and show why it is objectively invalid, unsound when we apply the rules of logic and critical thinking to it. And then into part two, I want to kind of dive a little deeper into gender because it's really amazing to me that although there might be some disagreement around the periphery as to where gender stops, what's biological sex, to what degree are each socially constructed, there's big chunks on which all thoughtful people who've ever researched this or understand it agree. And so it's not like I'm going way out of my lane in order to dive deep into some super sophisticated, specialized, minute expert detail, because 99.9% of any sort of scientists, psychologists, psychiatrists, sexologists, gender studies folks are going to agree about some general basic stuff about the term gender, how it's used and what it's meant, and what it is. So it's going to be really basic, and then we're going to show how and why the sorts of arguments that someone like Scott makes and these arguments for traditional gender roles can actually be harmful and lead to a moral wrong, or in trying to encourage people in a certain direction, we're doing something morally wrong. And then the final part's going to be about what should we do with someone in education who is espousing these beliefs that we can prove to be wrong, and what action should people take. And I'm guessing people might be a little bit surprised or at least unsatisfied by my recommendations, because there's something about this whole deal that we can learn, and everybody should know and learn about academics, professors, faculty members, teachers, instructors in higher education. And hopefully we can learn something from it. So again, as always, this will be an attempt to start a discussion, not finish one. There will be a few things that I'll just say, hey, that's just the way it is. But that's not me saying it. It's reason. It's logic. It's validity and soundness. It's contradictions are false. It's the principles of logic. So if you disagree with those, go read poetry. And we'll start now. So Scott Yenor, if you had not heard or didn't know who this dude was, and I didn't know who he was either, gave a talk at the National Conservatism conference in which he talked about feminism as causing all of these social ills and harms. And so what his argument was that women had, and I'm paraphrasing, but I'm peppering it with quotes of his. I'm not trying to unfairly tarnish what he said. This is what he said, was that women going out, being encouraged to be independent, enter the workforce, go out and find sexually satisfying lives for themselves, having, well, I think he said casual sex, trying to pursue their own self-interests and their own desires, trying to go out and make a living, enter the workforce, instead of sticking to traditional roles of what we might refer to as reproductive labor, the labor that takes place in the home, with regard to raising families and cooking for their husbands and supporting their husbands when they go out and do the work of the world, has been damaging to society and led to mental illness, addiction. I think the quote was, he said that women are more medicated, meddlesome, and something else than they need to be. So he's really kind of blowing the trumpet of super duper old school traditional gender roles, which there's an audience for. And one of the reasons why I want to consider an argument like this is there is such a big audience for it. And if those people claim to be rational, a lot of them claim to be, they want to follow logic and science and biology. Well, that's what we're going to do. And so once we've shown what those things will illustrate about these arguments, what logic and reason and science shows us, then you have to abandon some beliefs, period. That's just the way it is if you disagree with what I'm saying. It won't be disagreeing with me, it'll be disagreeing with logic. So, the first thing he says and goes to is wanting to blame feminism for these ills because historically women had played these roles and society worked great and it really led to the greatness of this nation and a country. And any nation needs women at home and men out in the workforce, and it ultimately started to crumble when feminism came along and encouraged women to leave the home and pursue their own desires rather than pursue the desires of the family. And it's led them to mental health issues, having single children. They're not caring for their children appropriately, so they have mental health issues. This whole breakdown of the fabric of the Western world, sort of, is what he's arguing, because women are shirking their responsibility to stay home and in the kitchen and in the bedroom and darning people's socks. Now, the first problem we have with this, and that we should, which is kind of a tiny one, but it is always a pet peeve of mine, is that he uses feminism as if this term is some broad general thing that specifically targets people. And it can't be both ways. I need to know what Scott Yenor's talking about with regard to feminism, because there's a million different flavors of feminism, and not all of them agree on everything. So when you say feminists do this or feminists say that, I need you to really clarify that. In part because it's almost like if I said, well, liberals say that. And if I said liberals, really liberal, all it means, really, like strictly speaking, is anybody who has a belief or usually a political belief that has some sort of foundation in something having to do with freedom. So I could be like a liberal, classical liberal, and Ronald Reagan, or I could be like Bernie Sanders, progressive liberal, or I could be a libertarian flavor of liberal. There's a million different flavors of liberal. And I don't think that Scott Yenor would want me to say Bernie Sanders and Ronald Reagan are the exact same thing. It's confusing if I say that. It's also confusing and misleading and vague and demonstrates a lack of understanding if you just say all feminists believe this. So real quick, I will tell you what all feminists believe. There's only a handful of things, and I say this because about, 15 to 20 years ago, whenever it was that I first started teaching feminism where I teach now, and I don't teach feminism as a class, but as a part of other classes that comes up. Intro to philosophy classes, social and political philosophy classes, ethics classes. You can think of all the places it could come up. And I wanted to teach it because I was recognizing my students had very different ideas about what it was. And the very first day of teaching this, I asked, okay, who can tell me what feminism is? And I had I'm dating myself, Arnold Horshack in the back. This young woman's hand rocketed up. And she was like, ooh, Mr. Carter. Not that. That was a bad Arnold Horshack impression. And I was like, yeah. And she said, feminists are just whiny bitches. I was like, whoa. She just got real, I guess, in my intro class. And I was like, Mom, no, that's not an adequate definition of what feminism is. But it came out that really what a whole lot of young people and people I think in general were thinking of as feminism is very loud, very vocal political activists of a certain sort. And that doesn't help you have a good idea of what feminism actually is. And that flavor of activist isn't necessarily a whiny bitch. So, what are the things we can say about feminism? Well, feminism is broken up into a million different flavors. You've got radical feminism, Marxist feminism, standpoint feminism, liberal feminism, egalitarian feminism, equity feminism, gender feminism. Like, we could go on and on and on. There's different flavors, different branches, different particular beliefs people have. And they fall in and out of favor over time. Some are dominant for a little while, some are not, like any other kind of political ideology. Now, the things that I believe they have in common, and I will totally put this in the comments, because it's super brilliant. Go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page, and I'm going to actually look it up because I feel terrible for not doing it, and I'm wasting your time. The entry there on feminism is awesome, and I don't know who wrote it, but we'll find out. In general, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, if you want to teach yourself philosophy, just read the whole thing. The entries there are awesome. It must have, I'm guessing, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, people started to get credit towards tenure, and people considered it a publication or something, because the entries are really overall spectacularly good. And I don't know who wrote this, and I'm too lazy to try to find out. But whoever did it, Noelle McAfee at Emory apparently crushed it. It's so good because, and the reason why it's good is it agrees with me. No, that's not why. It's so great to have a resource you can send students and people to, because it gives a really great overview of feminist philosophy. And so when I'm talking about feminism, I'm thinking of feminist theory or feminist philosophy, and not feminism in terms of necessarily activism. But you'll see where that fits in. And I'm going to borrow now from Noelle, because the way I used to put it, I used to say, hey, the only thing that we could attribute to all feminist beliefs is the idea that men and women are of equal moral value. Men and women are equally valuable. And then it starts to get political and activist flavor when you throw in a second claim, which is somewhere at some point and sometime in the world, they haven't been treated as such. And currently and historically, in the vast majority of places, that inequality has been advantageous to dudes. Those are the only claims I ever said I would ever attribute to all feminism. Some version of those all feminists believe. Now, Noelle goes into greater depth. I think she mentions her explanation includes something like both of those. And it's just awesome. So go check that out. But when we look at feminism that way and recognize that that's what feminism is, I'd be hard pressed to understand how and why feminists are to blame for women leaving the home. I think women recognizing or being encouraged to know that they matter and their wants, desires, hopes, dreams, aspirations matter just as much as men's hopes, dreams, desires, and aspirations matter, might be responsible for that. And if that's a result of feminism, that might be a good result. So if it's the case that women flocked from the home out into the business world, and that's had a negative impact on society, we still have a problem. One, it's clear that I don't think Scott Yenor's giving a fair presentation of feminism or what it is. And I don't even know if he understands it. But then a bigger problem logically, because it's not something that can be argued about. This is just objective. This is the way logic works and critical thinking works and argument analysis works. So you don't get to disagree with this unless you're just deciding that their reason doesn't work, contradictions are true, and you want to get rid of all of the rules of thinking and logic, which I don't think you do, is everything he says could be true. Let's just say it's true, hypothetically, right? And his conclusion still doesn't follow, which means his argument is invalid, meaning we shouldn't listen to it. We have to change it, or make it better, or just dismiss it entirely. He says feminism caused women to leave the home. He says because of that departure from these kind of reproductive flavors of labor, that there's been a downfall, right? Like this downward trend in society with regard to mental health, breakdown of the family, all these other social ills we'll see. Let's say both of those are true. Now his conclusion is, therefore we ought not encourage women to go into STEM fields or engineering, like science, technology, engineering, math. We shouldn't encourage them to go into business. We should encourage men to, and we should encourage young girls and women to stay at home, reproduce, be good wives, submit to their husbands, raise their children. Because that will get some of that labor that hasn't been done again. So there will be stronger families. There will be people at home taking care of kids. There will be less mental health issues. He's saying that. But here's the thing. I could concede everything he said so far and say it's true, which it's not, and still conclude with just as much certainty, Scott, why don't we just have some of the dudes do that labor? Why don't we have guys do that labor? Why don't we have men, right, do some of that labor? Some of those things that you're saying are no longer being done by women because they've entered the workforce. Why don't dudes pick up some of the slack? And the only argument, the argument I anticipate coming from him, and don't worry, I'll end this section on this note. The only argument I can anticipate coming from him is, well, women are naturally better at those things, so they have an obligation to do it, an obligation to society because they're better equipped for it. And that we can demonstrate is just patently false. Not all women are better at raising kids. Not all women are better at reproductive labor and managing a household. And similarly, not all men are better at engineering and math and business. So we can prove that. And this is a challenge I throw down elsewhere. But I would challenge Scott that I can find a woman who's better at everything he's saying should be masculine, male-only gigs, or he wants to encourage men to do. I can find a woman who does them better than he does. I don't care if it's political science. I don't care if it's finances. I don't care if it's fist fighting. I'll make a joke I made in a TikTok. Ronda Rousey could beat Scott Yenor's ass while breastfeeding her baby. I can find a woman who's better than him at all of those things. So if the argument was going to be, well, the reason women should do those jobs is they're better at it than men, that's just patently, objectively, demonstrably false. Because I can find women who are better than him at everything. And it probably wouldn't be that hard. And he can decide what criteria we're judging them on too. If he was going to be like, no, I'm the best political scientist in the world. Cool, what criteria do you judge a good political scientist based on? Publications, right? Like what? I'll find a woman who's way better at it than he is. So he really has no argument. There's no justification for the argument unless an old bugaboo of ours, he's going to like tag in faith or God or something. And as we know, we can't do that rationally. Can't use faith or God as an argument for a moral or political position rationally. Because if we say our faith counts, then we have to say everybody's faith counts, or we're contradicting ourselves. And then it just becomes a matter of my God versus your God. And that's ridiculous, right? Like we want to prove stuff and justify stuff. Or at least that's what I do, is examine and analyze when beliefs are justified or not. And his beliefs have to be unjustified because he has no justification for any of the claims we've made so far. So that's where we'll stop with this first very long section. As a reminder, his arguments about keeping women out of the workforce and in the home, he wants to say that would solve some of the problems that feminism created by getting women out of the workforce. He has a misunderstanding, or at least an incomplete explanation of what he means by feminism, and his conclusion doesn't follow from the premises because given the argument he's made, I'm just using what he's made, we could still conclude totally rationally, totally justifiably, that we can solve all the problems he illustrates by encouraging more men to get into the home and be more supportive of their families and that sort of thing. So that's part one, showing why Scott's arguments are really wrong. Part two is going to show how and why arguments about traditional gender roles and conception of gender can really be harmful, and we can demonstrate how they're morally wrong. This is going to be tricky, especially for conservatives, that there is nothing less conservative than trying to enforce gender roles, given the current state of what contemporary political conservatives believe. So you will see my stupid face next time, or hear me over your earbuds. Thanks for the time. Have an awesome day.